My name is Lucy Taxa. I'm currently the director of the Centre for Workforce Futures, although who knows what the future will hold. We are very, very happy to have Erin here with us today. The flyer has all the details about Erin that you would have seen as part of the advertising for today's event, and I will introduce him formally in a moment. I'll just acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Watamatigal people of the Darug Nation from Macquarie University, and I'm on Gadigal land in inner Sydney. Thank you everybody for coming. We're really excited to have Erin, who's the VP of Research and Advisory for Gartner's HR practice, speaking to us today. It links in with a major project that the Centre was involved with that was commissioned by Macquarie University on the future of work at Macquarie University. And it links in with a number of issues that we're all grappling with. Erin is an expert in this area. He's a behavioural scientist and coaching psychologist. He was recently named Top 100 Global HR Influencer by Engagedly. And he also advises on HR structures, operating models, and helps leaders manage their most critical relationships across the C-suite and boards. Alongside his current role, he is a fellow of the Australian Human Resource Institute, AHRI, and serves on the National Committee for the Australian Psychological Society's interest group in coaching psychology, and he's also an associate member of our Centre for Workforce Futures, and he's lectured at various universities. We're very, very pleased to have him here. He's raised some very interesting points in various media, including LinkedIn, which I enjoy liking a lot. And he's informed me that his presentation today is linked to an article that appeared in The Guardian, and it's by Alexia Cambon. Is that correct, Erin?
Yeah.
And she also works for the Gartner. And the article is, "The problem isn't remote working, it's clinging to office-based practices." And I will send that information to anybody who's interested after the event. So with no further ado, I'm sure you're all clapping to welcome Erin here in your own abodes or offices. And of course, this is the critical issue that we're all faced with about what sort of workplace are we best suited for, and also the critical issue of flexibility. So with no further ado, Erin, I'm handing it over to you. We do have a I think we have the question and answer function available to you. You can raise your hand, and we'll look forward to an interesting exchange. Thanks.
Right.
I'll put myself on stop video so you have full screen.
Okay. Thanks so much, Lucy. And it's my pleasure to join you. For a couple of reasons. I'm incredibly passionate about this topic, and as I kind of step through the data, you'll see that we have this inflection point in history, a very rare moment in time that gives us an opportunity to completely rethink how we design work in a way that's going to suit the future that we're all facing. And of course, the irony of us all of us here joining this via Zoom and all of its associated challenges is not lost on me. So what I might do is just let you know that I'm more than happy to take questions as we go through. We do have a bit of a late start though, so I'm going to kind of push through some stuff really quickly because there is a lot of content for me to share. But I'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A box. So if you do have any questions, I'm happy to field those kind of as we go. So like I said, today is, this incredible opportunity that we have to really question the inheritance that we've received around work. So this image kind of shows, probably around the 1920s, 1930s. And it's always, I think, helpful to set the scene in the context that the way that we currently work, which is both time-bound and office-centric, is really a vestige of these models that were arguably set up in the 19th century. When we were working in factories, you had to work between 9 and 5 because that's when you had access to natural light, when artificial light was not a very common resource and a very expensive one. And then, of course, as time went on, you probably found yourself, even if you were an office worker, not a factory worker, finding yourself using equipment that was bound to the office. So whether it's the types and telephones that you see here, I'm giving my age away here a little bit, but I still recall growing up in a small country town where we didn't have a telephone when I was a child. We used to have to go across to the neighbours across the road and use their rotary phone to dial in and speak to people. So chances are, until we got to around the 2000s, going to work meant that you had access in the office to equipment that was probably better than what you could afford at home. Now, of course, we're faced with almost the opposite situation, which is I'm sitting here in my home office, which is completely decked out like the Star Trek Enterprise. If I go into the office today, I'm faced with working on a small screen, hunched over a laptop, fighting for a place to find some quiet time to do my work. So we have this incredible opportunity to rethink how we design work and bring it up to date with the way that work is actually done. Now, of course, we're all sitting here today online because of COVID-19. Now, that did accelerate this trend towards remote and hybrid work models, but it's not as though that trend weren't already well underway. And it wasn't as though there wasn't a groundswell of support from employees to have access to more flexibility and remote working options. That was very clear. But anyone that interacts with leaders on a regular basis will be picking up a couple of things. Whilst employees generally have both enjoyed and welcomed the shift to hybrid work models, our leaders, not so much. So our leaders are essentially saying that as we made this shift that was almost forced on them by COVID into a remote or a hybrid model where people are moving kind of seamlessly between home locations and office locations, leaders communicated this kind of profound sense of loss around the way that we used to work. And in our research, we broke those down into 3 basic areas. So this isn't the full picture, but we lost consistency. So prior to the pandemic, most people had very consistent ways of working, locations of working, and even the means of doing their work. So if you were working in an office, chances are you were at the same types of desks, using the same types of computers, the same type of equipment, operating off the same types of time zones or calendars, for example. But of course, when we moved into the world of remote working, large scale or wide scale, what we found was that everyone was working out of a different type of an environment. So when you're working in your home office, some of us had, like myself, access to fantastic equipment and a dedicated office. Other people were working off a kitchen table with very poor equipment. I've even got a colleague that lives in Bondi Beach that there's 4 of them in a share house and they have to take turns using the kitchen table. So the consistency we lost was a deep concern, particularly for heads of HR. Then, of course, we had a loss of visibility. This was keenly felt by managers. So managers could no longer see into the worlds or the lives of their employees on a day-to-day basis. So of course they worried about things like productivity. Would our employees actually be working if they all went home? Now, the data is unequivocally that they work, and they worked a lot harder, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But there was this sense of we lost visibility into each other's work patterns, and particularly felt by managers. And then, of course, the great mythology of the loss of serendipity. So prior to the pandemic, there was this deeply held assumption that magical things happened around water coolers. Now, of course, anyone that works in the area of innovation knows that there's no evidence to support that. Innovation has always been something that we've had to purposefully drive rather than relying on serendipity and osmosis to happen. But having said that, leaders have felt this great sense of loss that bumping into each other in the hallways or around the water coolers has somehow prevented organizations from maintaining their ability to innovate and create. Of course, you can probably hear the disdain in my voice as I say that. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that's been impacted. Nevertheless, that sense of loss was there. So as we've adjusted to the immediate impacts of COVID and then moved more into adopting hybrid work models, what we found is that we've tried to, largely all over the world, recreate those things that we felt that we lost. So in order to recreate consistency, we basically virtualized everything. We're sitting on a Zoom call as a result of that. You know, in times past, 12 months ago, we would have probably been meeting on the campuses of Macquarie to have this conversation. So for employees, what they found was that not only did they replace all of their interactions with virtual interactions, which meant everything from team meetings to catch-ups with their managers through to the type of innovation sessions or collaboration sessions that we used to have. All of those things became virtual. And not only that, but they became back-to-back. Because we lost the need to move from one meeting room to the next, it literally meant that our meetings could be scheduled back to back up against each other, because chances are we were sitting in front of a computer in our own house attending those meetings. So if that doesn't sound fatiguing enough, and anyone that's working at the moment is probably reflecting on how fatiguing that is, well, it turns out that there is also a real thing called Zoom fatigue. So Zoom fatigue is the fact that virtual interactions require much more cognitive processing, as well as emotional processing. So we work a lot harder when we're doing virtual things. One thing I can say for certain, I do a session like this probably several times a day, almost 4 or 5 days a week. These types of sessions are much more fatiguing and complex to do than going out in person and facilitating a workshop or running a keynote presentation, for example. And you don't get the energy back from the audience. That's certainly the thing that I've found the most in terms of that. So virtualizing everything basically meant that we had a higher volume of meetings. They were compressed together. Because we weren't commuting, we could also have more meetings because we could start earlier, we could finish later, and the data says that employees aren't taking as many breaks. So if you've seen any data that says that productivity went up during COVID, there's a pretty big chunk of the answer. It did because we could do more things. Now, in terms of our attempts to recreate visibility, well, we kind of did the same thing. So we did see a significant increase in the use of employee monitoring software. So I don't need to get into too much around the impacts of a lack of trust on employee engagement and performance. But essentially what we also found was that managers, because they didn't have direct line of sight into what their employees were doing, meant that they were scheduling more regular checkups, again, more virtual ones, to make sure that their employees were okay and that they were working. And then finally at the bottom, to encourage more opportunities for people to virtually bump into each other, we started to create specific virtual meetings around collaboration and probably the worst of the lot, around forced social interaction. So about 12 months ago, many of you might have been joining your very first virtual workplace drinks sessions. Now, if I was asked to attend one of those today, I would probably yell at the person and never speak to them again. We just didn't respond well to those things. They lasted for maybe a month, and then they very quickly disappeared. Now, the result of all of that, whether it's trying to recreate consistency or visibility or serendipity, is that we ended up with more meetings. Our days became extended. And all of that has led to record levels of employee fatigue. So if you kind of break it down, we virtualized everything. And by the way, what you see here, this blue box, this is the baseline level of fatigue that employees already were experiencing from a combination of digital distraction, which was the encroaching of technology meant that our days were expanding anyway. Virtual overload, so being asked to constantly update your skill sets around digital applications. And then this very insidious always on culture that had been developing over many, many years. So this is the baseline level of fatigue before COVID. So before lockdowns, before homeschooling, before the toilet paper rush, all of the stress that came from the adjustments in society and the adjustments that we had to make to how we did our work. Then we added more virtualization on top of it. We then added more meetings on top of that. And then we added tracking, which increased this sense of employees had to even continue to pretend to work, even though they were already working longer than they were prior to COVID. Depending upon the source, that additional number of hours for employees is anywhere between 2 to 4 hours per day that they are working longer since the COVID crisis began. Now, what we're able to do is very clearly link levels of fatigue in the workplace to risks when it comes to talent management challenges. So we do know that when a workforce is experience higher levels of fatigue, that team innovation drops, discretionary effort drops, employee performance drops, effective team collaboration drops, sense of inclusion felt by employees drops, and their intent to stay drops catastrophically, as you can see here. This is really concerning if you're an employer. Australia has just entered the most buoyant employment market that we've seen in more than 20 years. The competition for talent has never been stronger. With closed borders, that competition for talent is not just at the skilled, educated level, but it's also at the unskilled labouring level. So right now, you'll see very similar levels of competition for everything from artificial intelligence engineers at the top down to fruit pickers and construction labourers at the bottom. That's a unique set of circumstances, combined with very high confidence in the job market, combined with employees that if they kept their job are probably cashed up because they weren't spending their money, except on their houses, which have been going up in value at a record rate. So they're probably sitting on large value in terms of the equity in their homes as well. So that combination of factors means that employees today have more choice than they had 10 years ago, and they have a greater opportunity to take risks. So if you're exhausted and there's lots of opportunities out there and you can afford to take some risks, it's no wonder that we're starting to see significant evidence of people rethinking their employment relationship. Unfortunately, what we've also seen is that the reaction of most enterprise leaders has been trying to, what we would say, fit a square peg into a round hole. So most leaders are really trying to convince their employees that it's time to come back to the office. Never more so than in the public sector, because of course they're locked into real estate agreements, whereas in the private sector, the CFOs are happy to get rid of their office spaces if it saves them a lot of money. But you've also got this enormous pressure from government to use the public sector as a way of invigorating the CBD economies. So there's enormous pressure across enterprise leaders to bring people back. There's also a notion that for some organizations, they've liked what they've seen during COVID, which is higher levels of productivity and employees that have actually surprised them in terms of the way that they've operated and behaved. So for many organizations, there is also an equal tendency to keep things going as it is. But what I'll share in a moment is that what is absolutely clear is that neither the past nor our current approach is feasible in the long term. So we really need to rethink, how do we do our work in a world that is more than likely to continue being hybrid for a whole variety of reasons that I'll share in a moment. So this data point that you see down here, 75% of hybrid or remote employees say their expectations for working flexibly have increased. That is absolutely across the board. And it's not just for remote and hybrid employees. In fact, we've seen the same data for traditional on-site employees. So they might not be expecting that, they can do exactly what their office-based colleagues did and work from home. But what they are expecting is more flexibility around when they do their work and how they do their work. And you can see here, only 4% of current hybrid or remote employees have a preference for an on-site arrangement. And interestingly, this figure of 4% is a pretty good reflection of the current occupancy rates that we're seeing in the average office in the CBD. So even though, relatively speaking, until quite recently, most of Australian employees have been able to go back to the office, they've been invited to go back to the office, and it has been relatively safe to do so. Barely any office is sitting with any more than 10% occupancy rate as we sit here today. So what that kind of means from our perspective is that option one is probably not a real option. Employees enjoy flexibility. They want more options to work remotely. They don't want to go back to what the office-centric model used to be. And depending again on the data source that you cite, up to 39% of the workforce would consider quitting their job if they were forced to go back to that office-centric design from the past. Arguably, option two is an even worse option, which is to continue what we're doing now, which is kind of having one foot in each camp, but trying to run the hybrid model as though we were still in offices. And the reason for that being not an option is that the fatigue levels are so high that they're bordering on mental health challenges. And there's been a few things that have happened in the last month that are absolutely groundbreaking shifts in direction for Australia. So the first one is that we had the state and federal ministers agree to enshrine psychological health in the Workplace Health and Safety Act. Now, it's always been there. Employees have always had a responsibility to provide a psychologically safe environment. But today, because of that decision, it's now much more easy to enforce that. We've also seen a landmark report from WHO that shows that the rates of stress, anxiety, and deaths as a result of heart attack and stroke are directly linked to workplace stress. So the body of evidence has been growing for some time around that. It's here now. We've also then, just in the last couple of weeks, we saw one of the first successful workers' compensation claims filed by a remote worker for psychological injury due to excessive workload. Not only was that judgment upheld, but the defense given by the employee's supervisor was, well, because they were working remotely, I couldn't see the impact of that excessive workload on their mental health. Of course, the judges threw that out and said it was the responsibility of that workplace and that supervisor to provide a safe working environment. And there's been a whole bunch of other decisions of recently that essentially provide even more impetus behind some of those trends that we're seeing. So option two, it's not really an option unless we're happy to see much higher rates of psychological injury, potentially even death across our workplaces, and then of course deal with the impact of that. So what's really left is option three, which is we need a new model that is based on a hybrid work environment, that not only allows us to increase or continue performance, but also to make sure that we're managing and reducing the worst impacts of what we've seen from a virtual environment. So what does that look like? Well, for us, firstly, it's about giving employees flexibility they need to step away from all of the distractions, to create the best work environment to do their best work. I've been very vocal over a number of years that the future of work is going to be dominated by complex work done by complex human beings. And so that type of work absolutely requires people to be in their best performance zones. So we know that the data will continue to support that view. The second thing we need to do is set intentional collaboration norms that are designed to limit those more draining interactions, but take advantage of the open networks that we have access to. But there are a whole bunch of dangers in that as well that we manage. And then finally, we have to drive empathy from leadership to advocate for disconnecting while improving life experience. So this is a profound shift that we're seeing, not to see employees as employees or workers, but to see them as full human beings. And so the expectation will be that leaders are not just there to drive productivity and performance, but they're there to protect employees from the worst parts of the system that tend to make them work more than they need to. So what that will look like is, if you think about the shift we need to make, it's from this office-centric design model that you see on the left. So that's where we were focused on providing consistent experiences. So everyone got the same desk, everyone got the same environment. And a lot of that, by the way, is driven by a sense of equity. But sometimes in our attempts to create equity, we actually create inequity elsewhere. And the classic example of that is, well, not everyone can work from home. So therefore, what we're going to do is create a policy whereby everyone comes into the office 3 days per week. Now, that on the surface seems fair and potentially equitable. But remember that if you're a senior executive, there's a very good chance that you live closer to the office because you can afford to. You might even have a parking spot under the building, which means that you can drive rather than taking public transport. You've probably also got daycare provided. You may even have a nanny at home. You've probably got a cleaner, etc., etc. So whilst on the surface it might seem equitable to make everyone work 3 days a week, well, that might not be equitable for those people that have to make the longest trips into work and don't have access to those resources. So rather, what we want to do is provide flexible work experiences. So with the underlying principle here of equality of opportunity to flexibility, rather than trying to enable serendipitous collaboration, which is innovation by chance and osmosis, what we really want to do is enable intentional collaboration. So that's work design by innovation by design, where we purposefully bring people together to collaborate. And then rather than relying on visibility-based management, which is management by inputs, we want to start managing by outputs. And that requires a much more empathy-based approach to management. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to pause and check to see if there are any questions coming through the chat box. Alternatively, I'm not sure if we've enabled this, but if you want to take yourself off mute and ask any questions, by all means, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was really, really valuable. And while you're looking to see if there's any questions, I'll just point out to you that one of the things that we discovered in our project was that employees saw the right to flexibility, even though it's enshrined in law and so on and so forth, as a privilege. Mm-hmm. And as a sign to be grateful to their employer or their manager. I wonder if you've got any practical suggestions in that regard in terms of how organisations can change that mindset, which creates this view of, oh, I'm so privileged if I get part-time work or flexibility and so on.
I don't want to be flippant about this, but I think that has just broken. The reality is that, and I'll share this, I did at the end of this presentation, but I'll quickly reference it. This is the most recent data that we've collected on expectations around access to flexibility. So this is global. I would argue Australia has one of the highest expectations in the world for flexibility. And what you'll see here is like 74% of remote and hybrid employees, so their employees that worked that way during COVID, their expectations for working flexibly have actually increased since the pandemic. But the scariest one is that more than almost half of on-site employees, so these are employees that have never had access to that type of flexibility, they also expect to get more. And then on this side, you'll see that essentially what this is saying is that I would consider leaving my organization if I don't get access to more flexibility. So 55% of all employees are thinking that way. And it turns out 40% of on-site employees. So I think we've almost reached a tipping point where employees do expect the right to work flexibly. Now, the way it's going to show up is that those employees that have more choice will exercise that. But like I said, the time to make hay while the sunshine is now. We've got closed borders and the most competitive employment market in more than 25 years. So we will see employees exercising that choice where they have that type of power and influence. Like I said before, you would expect that at the higher ends of the technology sphere, for example, or in the professions. But what's really interesting at the moment is that you've got the same amount of competition for fruit-picking laborers. So I wouldn't be surprised if we even see some white-collar workers quitting, saying, you know what, I've been working like a dog for 12 months. I'm sick of being in front of a computer. I'm going to go and get a job in construction where I can get outside, get fit, and feel a bit more healthy and maybe contributing in a different way to the world. So we're going to see a lot of movement of talent. Some theorists are calling this the Great Resignation, which is essentially a movement of talent spurred on by opportunity, economic growth, but also the fact that we've spent 12 months reflecting on what is important to us. So amazing things happen after pandemics. I'll remind everyone that, after the Black Death went through Europe, it changed it destroyed the feudal system. So that's how powerful a pandemic can be. And we saw very similar shifting of society in the wake of the Spanish flu in 1918. So we're in the middle of one of those times, and profound changes will happen. A lot of it will be driven by employees exercising choice and bargaining power that they haven't always historically had.
Erin, I think I can, I've got a question from, I think it's Greg Bamber, and I can press a button, I think, to allow him to talk. So let me see if this works. Greg.
Yes, can you hear me, Lucy?
We can hear
All good.
You. Yes.
Speaking from Melbourne, Monash University, just as we're hoping to emerge out of our fourth lockdown. So thank you very much to you and Erin for an interesting and topical presentation. My question, I've got many questions, but just one of them at this point is, what's your advice, Erin, to employers who wish to increase their monitoring and surveillance of staff during the pandemic and beyond, because the technologies are there now to be able to engage in this surveillance, from keystroking to their communications and so on and so forth. And some employers are really tempted to try and do that.
Yeah. Schrodinger's cat is probably what comes to mind. So, the active observation changes that which is observed. So there's actually a really rich body of data that was collected pre-COVID in the academic literature, and then during COVID, and then obviously as we're scrambling to collect more data now. And pretty much all of it points to a universal truth which is remote work really is only effective where there are high levels of trust. So my view on surveillance is, if you're surveilling your employees in order to measure their productivity and performance, you're very likely to see a negative reaction. So it will do these things that we saw on this previous page, where we'll see a lot of evidence of things like discretionary effort, intent to stay, engagement, etc., will be driven down. That's what the data points to. But given that what we're fighting is record levels of fatigue, because essentially we've given autonomy to employees. So this is the amazing thing that happened during COVID, is that we did largely trust employees to go home and keep working. And we didn't largely monitor them. So most organizations didn't really monitor their employees. And lo and behold, what did we see? We saw people working even harder, and to the point where it's dangerous to their health. So that points to some other research that we've collected, which shows that during a crisis, you don't want to give too much autonomy around decision-making, because employees make bad decisions in a crisis. So I think the lesson there is that if you're using monitoring to make sure that people stop working, to make sure that they take breaks, to make sure that they're working in healthy ways, then that could be a good thing. So think about your Apple Watch, or your Fitbit that tells you to stand if you've been sitting too long, or encourages you to, close the loop on the number of steps that you're taking. If organizations take that approach, and that monitoring is about protection, in the same way that, the truck drivers on a Rio Tinto mining site have caps that measure the risk of microsleeps. We need that. I would argue that what's been demonstrated during COVID is that we cannot trust employees to provide the self-discipline to work in healthy ways. They'll learn it over time, but the damage might be done before it's too late. So yeah, that, I'm not against monitoring. What I'm probably against is the wrong use of monitoring. Did that answer your question, Greg?
I've muted
That's all right. I'll move on.
I can't seem to. Oh,
yes, thank you. So thank you very much, Aaron. And just one other reflection, if I may, on your good point about the pandemics changing the world, and about working long hours. I've been up almost all night for the last couple of nights participating in a World Congress in Sweden, and part of the discussion last night with some leading international scholars was that perhaps the pandemic may have an unintended consequence of heralding the end of neoliberalism, because we've seen many countries, even the US under Trump and so on, not to mention Australia and the UK under their leaders, bringing back Keynesian economic policies, increasing the role of government in ways that were just unimaginable only 15 or 16 months ago, before the pandemic began.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. So we've seen that, and I think it's true. And what we've also seen in the world of work is what you're seeing on this page here, which is, it turns out that if you create a human-centrically designed workplace that actually protects employees from exploitation and overwork, and gives them the adequate safety nets that they need in terms of psychological safety, well, guess what? Fatigue not only drops, and it drops by like a huge amount, but it drops into the zone where we're actually energizing our employees. So in a world that demands more with less, this kind of idea of discretionary effort is the fuel of modern economies and is the fuel of knowledge work. So arguably what you get if you give people autonomy over where, when, and how they work, and if you respect their needs to have a healthy, balanced life, well, you get more energized employees that can deliver much higher levels of output, particularly in the context of knowledge work. Now, I do think there's a darker side to non-knowledge work, where technology is likely to increase the levels of exploitation. But in knowledge work, and I used this analogy a little bit earlier today, you can arguably get together thousands of underfed, disgruntled serfs, and they can build you a temple. But you cannot get a disgruntled, underfed, exhausted serf to paint the ceiling of that with a masterpiece. And so that's kind of what we're facing in our economies, is that the modern economy will be driven by complex knowledge work. And that requires well-rested, healthy, psychologically sane human being liver. And the robots will tell us this more and more as time goes on. So, you know, you can actually drive levels of activity, quality, and performance by treating people like the humans that they are. That also increases their loyalty, as you see here. And here's the big kicker. This is a 28-point difference in the percentage of high performers that you have in your organization if you treat them like humans. So yeah, you know, I'm a bit of a lefty from way back, so I'm quite keen to watch how some of these societal changes are occurring. So what I thought I'd do here is just share a couple of pointers around, well, what are organizations actually doing about this out in the field as they try and build more flexibility, introduce more intentional collaboration practices, and also introduce empathy-based management. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the first thing I would say is that the piece of advice we give to organizations is, as you introduce flexibility, don't make it about policy. You know, policy has this horrible tendency to create restrictions, and it's generally designed for the lowest common denominator. In other words, you set a flexible working policy in a way that is designed to avoid the risk of the worst employee essentially taking the mickey out of that policy. So what we're seeing organizations do that are having real success is that they're setting principles. And so this is an example from an organization in North America called Schroders. So for them, everyone works flexibly. We want to give access to everybody for flexibility in whatever way that works for the job that they have. And the way that they manage that is to recognize that there are essentially three competing tensions in an organization. The first one is, well, what are the personal preferences and needs of that employee? But that needs to be balanced with the needs of their team. So for example, if my preference is to work 5 days a week from home, but I've got a team that needs to work together on a project that actually does require face-to-face and deliberate collaboration, well, I've got to flex a little bit to make sure that I'm not upsetting that team and unnecessarily impeding that team from delivering on its outcomes. At the same time, our clients also have needs. So those needs might sometimes mean that my personal preferences can't always be delivered upon. So what I like about this example from Schroders is that they see this as a healthy tension point. And then they invest heavily in prepping managers, employees to be able to sit down and work out these tension points to come to an individualized level of flexibility that's going to work for that employee, their team, the organization, and their customers. So really like that example from Schroders. When we get into intentional collaboration, this is probably, to me, one of the best ways of looking at the way that work is done, and in particular, knowledge work. So for those who know me, I used to be a musician, you know, back in the day. And one of the things that I learned about collaboration and creativity as a musician is that good work happens in all of these domains. So for example, most of my best songs were written, or at least the idea would be come up with when I was exercising. So either riding a motorcycle, I don't know why this occurs, I've got my theories on it, or going for a run. An idea would come into my head, or maybe I'd be sitting at home playing with my guitar and an idea would form for a song. That could be a lyric, it could be a lick, it could be a little riff on a guitar. What I would then do is take it to a collaborative partner. So in this case, there was another member of the band that was also a songwriter. So I would share these early ideas and we would kind of get together and take the rough bits, form it into a loose song, and then eventually we would take that into the band room and everyone would practice it. And, you know, essentially you would jam a song together till you got to a minimal viable product. Now that minimal viable product, I might then take away and further perfect it. So add a bridge, flesh out the lyrics, create a chorus, whatever it might be. And eventually I'd take it back and maybe perform it in front of an audience. And the audience then gives you its own feedback, which changes the song again. And if it was a good enough song and it was popular enough, it might end up on an album, in which case that you would have a producer or an engineer that would come in and then create, add even more components to it. So the point I'd make is that creative tasks not requires alone time. It requires working together. But there's also times where you might be sitting together in the jam room working on your separate sections of something as well. And here's the clincher. You can do all of that, not like the way I did it 25 years ago, which is like recording it onto a tape and then mailing it to each other. But today you can literally do this over the internet. And one of my colleagues, for example, produced an album during COVID where he was based in Sydney and his collaborating partners were based in various cities across the UK, from Birmingham to London to Liverpool. So that was all done using technology, and that's where we are today. Here's the thing we learned though, is that employees do not want to do this anymore. So their view is, why should I get in a car or a public transport and go on a lengthy commute to sit in the office next to people doing work that I could do at home because I don't need to collaborate with them? They also learned that they produced a much higher quality of work when they weren't distracted by the open plan office, where they could go for a walk to think through their ideas, where they could sit on their couch, pat their dog or their cat as they thought through the solution to a complex problem. What they want to do now is come together purposefully when it makes sense to collaborate. And they're very comfortable collaborating over virtual means. We just don't want this to be the dominant focus of our work anymore. And it happens to be that this is what leaders think good work looks like. So it needs to be working together or working together apart. But what the data shows is when it comes to innovation, it's almost 50-50 between synchronous work together and asynchronous work, which might be working together separately or working alone to achieve a task or an outcome. So as a result of this, what we've seen is that this increase in virtual meetings, as opposed to seeing the type of solutions that you see here. So what about having no meeting days where I don't have to sit on Zoom call after Zoom call? What about having dedicated mental health days? And thankfully that's becoming more common. Or even no email days. Wouldn't that be a joy? Where I was literally allowed to go in the office and not check email all day. So we want to see a lot more creativity around how that works. And this to me is one of the best examples of trying to do something practical. So this is from Dropbox. And what you'll see here is that this dotted red line, this represents the hours that are set for synchronous collaboration. If you're a leader, you cannot ask an employee to attend a meeting outside of this time zone. And that's designed to stop this creep where our days become longer and longer and longer because we have all of these people setting these meetings all over our calendars. And the other thing you'll see in here is that exercise is blocked out. This could equally be pick up the kids. This could equally be, I'm going to play guitar for half an hour. So it's this recognition that employees should be allowed to put in in things into their calendars that give them better work output. If that's exercise or relaxation or yoga or whatever it is for you, you're allowed to prioritize that. And the final thing I'll talk about is empathy-based management. So this is what we found managers really struggling with, is that they lost sight of the performance of their employees, but they also lost sight of whether they're suffering virtual fatigue, or they're struggling to disconnect, or they've got overwhelming caretaker responsibilities. So we know that in this new hybrid environment, the ability for a manager to be aware of and empathetic to the struggles of employees becomes even more important. And so what you hear is a practice from Atlassian, obviously a great Australian success story, where what they've realized is that the role of managers in the hybrid world is to be empathetic first. And so they recognize that one of the biggest problems for empathy for managers is that they might not have the skills. So they do spend some time training them on how to be vulnerable and how to demonstrate empathy. A lot of managers don't think it's their job. So they spend a lot of time rethinking that mindset and making sure that their leaders are absolutely crystal clear that the well-being of their employees is the top priority. And in fact, not only is it the top priority, it's more important than performance, because Atlassian's view is that well-being leads to higher performance. But the most important thing they're tackling is capacity. So they've realized that it's really hard to be empathetic if you are also stressed. And it turns out anyone who looks at this area knows that our frontline and middle managers are the most stressed people in our organizations. So they've given permission to managers not just to focus on well-being, but to get rid of tasks and responsibilities off their plate, so they can carve out more time to be empathic and to focus on that well-being. There's another company called Goodway. They're tackling it a different way, which I think is interesting. So rather than leaving it up to the managers to do that, Goodway Group have said, what we're going to do is create specific jobs. So they have what's called a team support officer. Their job is to monitor the health of teams and to intervene when necessary. So what you're seeing here is an example of their health monitor. So if they see an issue with a team around cohesion or performance or accountability or trust, they're given the empowerment to step in and design an intervention that's designed to strengthen that team. And by the way, embedded in here is psychological safety. So one of the biggest measures that they look at is the psychological safety of teams. So it turns out that if you can get your managers to be more empathic, or more importantly, create empathic management practices, you end up with this 64% of your employees being high performers in a high empathy-based management environment. And they're also 2.77 times more likely to have high levels of organizational trust. So as I said before, trust is the foundational necessity for effective remote and hybrid work. All right, I'm conscious that I'm about 5 minutes over time, so we'll wrap up here. I'm just going to leave this open. I ended up creating this slide because I was asked so often by heads of HR who said, look, we get it. We know that we're not going back to the old way of working, but to be honest, leaders are still pushing ahead with convincing employees to come back to the office. So we don't agree with it. We don't think it's right, but they've made their decision. So I ended up putting this together to say, well, first of all, careful what you wish for if you're a leader. If you start forcing people back to the office, you're going to be losing most of the productivity gains that they got by getting rid of their commute times. So you're also going to lose all of the wonderful quality we're able to get by having that alone time to do concentration work. So the type of work that they'll do in offices will be valuable stuff, but it won't be the grunt work that your employees have been delivering over the last 12 months. So expect productivity to go down, and to go down significantly. But you might have to convince your employees that the office is a good place to go to. So these are just my 10 reasons to come to the office. And if we use these things as the focus of the office, we can probably get hybrid right. But if we ask people to come into the office to do work that they could do at home, we're going to get it very, very wrong. All right, so I'll leave it there. Any questions that I can answer? And again, feel free to take yourself off mute and jump on, or Lucy, if you have to manage that, go ahead.
If anybody puts their hand up, I will. I think nobody has to date. Oh yes, Juliet Burke's got a question. Let me just see if I can allow her to talk.
Actually,
Juliet?
Aaron, yeah, thanks so much, Lucy. Actually, Aaron, I just wanted to say that was brilliant. I think you've done a really good job of painting your stories. Might not have always agreed with you on some of the minutiae around it, but I think directionally really good and solid argument, not just to replace what we were doing in the office with virtual and then continue it on. So that was great. So actually not a question, Luce, because I know we're at time, but just a commendation.
Thank you, Juliet, and thank you, Erin. Lots of food for thought, and I think the accountability for empathy is the singularly significant overarching point. We know that trust is crucial, of course, and that empathy contributes to trust. But in fact, it seems that trust is sorely lacking in all our organisations, and certainly in our universities these days. I think there is one more question, and then we'll have to sign out. Elizabeth. Yeah. Elizabeth Moore?
You can't leave now.
Yes.
Sorry, thank you both for an excellent session. Watching what's going on, particularly in the university sector, including at Macquarie, Erin, your thoughts on how best to deal with what's happening in terms of redundancies, in terms of not only how people are dealt with who are made redundant, but how the others deal with the quite high levels of redundancies and mishandling of the ways in which they've been done.
Yeah, I'm personally very worried about this for a couple of reasons. So firstly, I did spend about 10 to 12 years of my career leading outplacement organizations. So, during the GFC, I worked directly with thousands of people who had lost their jobs. So the first thing I would say is that there is a degree of care and support that is required to help people transition when they leave organizations. So to me, that's just table stakes, though. That's like the bare minimum. What I'm a little bit more concerned about is the survivors. That's the term that it used to be called. And I am delivering this message very pointedly to leaders as I speak to them every day, which is we already have record levels of fatigue. We already run our organizations on the smell of an oily rag. There is literally no fat left in organizations. It was stripped out during the GFC and never added back in. We've got a mentality of do more with less, and that is reliant on employees being willing to do more than they're paid for. So what organizations are about to enter into is this phase of people leaving in droves, which means that the people left, so there's a lot to unpack here, but essentially most organizations do not replace people when they leave until they absolutely have to. So they play the gambit of how long can we leave it to the people that are left to pick up the slack until things start breaking. So the point I make to leaders today is that the things that will break in the next 12 to 18 months are the people. The difference is when they break, you will be responsible for the damage. So if you're a company director, I would be thinking very carefully about whether your organization can survive on the smell of an extinguished rag, right? That's the first thing. So there is a business continuity risk. The second one is, are you willing to face a manslaughter charge because you're asking your leaders to push their employees beyond what they're capable of doing? That's my view, is that the biggest risk is capacity and it's unreasonable workloads.
And the loss of credibility and trust in the way both sides are managed, those being made redundant and those who stay. And that's, that's essentially what trust and credibility are about in this.
Yeah, exactly. And, I didn't say this right at the beginning, but I ran a session yesterday for the AHEIA. And I started that session by basically saying, I was the first of my family to go to university. So I have this deep appreciation for what an education delivers. I'm deeply concerned about what I see as a bit of an ideological attack on higher education from our current government. But if I put that aside, the future of work is about complex cognitive work. Healthy universities are absolutely critical to get that right. On the positive side, what I would say is that there are some things happening in higher education that I think represent an opportunity to rethink the value and purpose of higher education. Maybe the over-reliance on exporting to foreign students might mean a greater emphasis will be placed on other aspects of higher education. So that is my kind of advice, is to say that resilience is a highly tangible thing in the sense that it's also highly variable. So what can be stressful can also be challenging and invigorating. And one of the core differentiators is the degree of agency that you have as you face what's occurring to you. So my advice to anyone in higher education is to put their thoughts towards how do we rebuild it for a new future? And that might help offset some of the worst impacts of what we're seeing to the sector at the moment. And by the way, that is a completely inadequate answer because there are so many components to this.
Thank you so much, Erin. It was very, very relevant to the situation that we're all in at the moment. Certainly, I empathise with you, having been the first member of my family to go to university, thanks to the Whitlam education policies. I think our universities are being fundamentally undermined in all sorts of ways, and perhaps in a future session on some other planet we might be able to discuss the impact of digitisation on knowledge and the homogenisation of knowledge, which I think is a critical issue.
Yeah. And by the way, one of the things that I'm predicting, I might be wrong on this, which is many professionals are rethinking what they want to do with their lives. When people rethink what they want to do with their lives, it almost invariably leads to a retraining. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see the demand from the workforce to access higher education actually increases as people reconsider what the next pathway is going to be for them. So I think there will be some silver linings. We just can't see them yet.
I hope so. And look, thank you so much, Erin, for your time and your knowledge and insight. It's been really fantastic. I feel like we should all become musicians like you. And we have been recording this session. And so once it's finalised and edited, we will make that available to everybody that registered. So let me thank you again, Erin. Thank you, everybody, for attending this event, maybe the last for us. and wish you all the very best in living with hybridity.
Thank you
very much. Thank you, Lucy and Aaron. That was brilliant.
Thank you.
Very timely, very topical. Good on you.
Thank
Cheers.
you, everybody. And I might sign off now. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.